Welcome to another episode of Erasing Shame. This is season 2. My name is DJ Chuang, and I'm joined with my co-host, Maylee Chang, out in Minnesota. Thank you for joining us again.
Yes.
And we have a lot to talk about today. On this episode, we're going to be talking about trauma and shame, which is a pretty heavy topic. So I think it would be helpful if Maylee, you would describe to our listeners and viewers what exactly is trauma for those that have experienced it and don't know what it is, and those that haven't. How can they help others?
Yeah. So just the gist of it. So trauma, when somebody goes through a very hard crisis, could be anything. Typically, lots of emotions come out. First it's, numb, shock, and then, processing through anger, sadness, and shame. And so what we want to talk about is trauma and shame. And today we're going to talk about the refugee experience, the trauma of the refugee experience and shame, and what that looks like. And so just a little bit more about the shame piece and trauma, with sadness, you get a chance to mourn the situation. You get to, at best, you have compassion for yourself. With, guilt, then maybe you feel like you get to do something about it. With anger and anxiety, it solves as a safety, and then it also, with anger, it's like, no, this shouldn't have happened to me. And those are, they don't feel good, but they're functional. And then with shame, this is just my perspective. With shame, it feels it's more toxic. It lingers longer. It's interesting because it's almost a infliction on the soul, and it becomes a part of you. It isolates you. It somehow turns the situation inward where it should be outwards to the person or the others that have inflicted this trauma on you. And so, so shame is definitely toxic and very important to talk about. Yeah, so that's the gist of it.
Yeah, well, that's great. And I think part of the challenge is because we don't talk about it, that trauma and shame are such intensely painful things. The default tendency in particularly certain cultures, and then we've heard about post-traumatic post-traumatic stress disorder from the wars. So those are horrific incidents, and all this pain gets internalized and hidden and unprocessed, and that's when it becomes terribly unhealthy. And so I'm hoping that from our conversation today that we can help people identify if they've got these hidden pains that need processing through honest talk with someone like a therapist and a good friend. So how does that appear in the life of a refugee that comes to America?
Yeah. So so a little bit more background on, so when a crisis happens, right, it could be short-lived or it could be continual. But when we're talking about refugees, I mean, this is month-long to years of re-traumatizing, and what it looks like specifically is being uprooted from your home, running from the enemy, on the way, being robbed, you're being raped, being, watching your family get killed, and then running into the refugee camp, and then transitioning in there, just life in the refugee camp itself. For me as a child, when I was there, I grew up, like I said, from when I was born, 1 month old, basically to when I was 8. In my memory, I think my parents did a good job of protecting me. And so I actually have good memories, interestingly, but when my parents talk about it, it's definitely a very different picture. And so even through, years of being in a refugee camp and then having to uproot from that and then going into a land and a culture and a language that you don't know anything about, is it becomes a way of life. It, it's something that somehow your family just doesn't talk about anymore. And for me, it was normal. It was my way of life. And so I think, I think with that, just living through that hardship, it just becomes a way of life. And it takes years, and even until recently, I think more people, and even my family, were finally talking about it, finally realizing, you know what, we struggled through trauma this whole time, and when I was a teenager, I mean, it was off my radar. I had no clue that it was bothering my family and the people around me. And so typically when someone goes through trauma, chronic trauma, you, as a human, you want to cope with it. You want to feel better. And so for some, they cope negatively, right? Drugs, alcohol, getting, in trouble with the law, finding a space for yourself, so that you belong. Sometimes for kids, that's, gangs. And then for others, it's just like my family, myself, you just don't talk about it. And so it was.
Let's unpack some of those words that you use. So chronic is something that's ongoing, right?
Right.
Rather than just an incident.
Right.
Like I don't know, like 9/11 would be more of an incident because it was a specific event. And then it sounds like the refugee experience, you're running for literally running for your life. And so you're in this survival mode just to survive. Mm-hmm. And then perhaps in your own life or your own family, then when did you go from survival mode to kind of a safety mode where you're no longer just all your energy is focused on just surviving, and now you can relax a little bit and get adjusted to life? Was there a point in your life when that started to happen, and then you had some room to get in touch with your emotions?
Yeah. I think acculturating, right? So getting all that out of the way, and then going through, as a child, going through that poverty phase, and then, your family working and getting more finances to kind of stabilize the basic needs. So with that, and then for myself growing up, and then I think I was in my mid-20s when I first became aware of the significance and atrocity of the situation. And so when I was in grad school, I had a lot of time to process. I remember a season where I was just so broken. I was angry. And I prayed a lot through that season, and really worked through it with friends, speaking out on it. I remember sharing it in chapel in college for the first time, sharing my experiences with my friends that are not Hmong. So just opening up and then processing through it. Also with a therapist. That really brought me out of, a lot of internal pain. And so one interesting thing about this whole experience when I said, like, when I was a child and a teenager, when I was kind of unaware of all the situation, the only emotion I remember feeling was shame. So I thought that was very interesting, just reflecting on that time of my life. Shame was very big. Even as a child, you learn to compare yourself, like, wow, why don't I have this like other people? How come my parents don't, speak English like other parents, or like other East Asian parents who are educated and, speak English well. Yeah, so then I think shame was very big as a child and even in my teenage years. But I think when you're a teenager, you become a little bit more like, you have a little bit more pride of like sassiness. So like, no, this is who I am, I'm cool. So then experiencing that, there's definitely still shame, but it's manifests itself in more of a defense mechanism, like, no, I'm better than those people, because I went through this experience and this is who I am. But I think truly dealing with it, the honest emotions, the anger and the pain and the sadness, and also the self-compassion, was when I was in my mid-20s. And even then until now, it's still, I think it's going to be a lifelong process. Things will come and go. But yeah, since then, I think I feel like I'm more in the normal phase, a new normal, not the old normal. Yeah.
Yeah, and perhaps one way to describe the new normal is you feel safer,
Mm-hmm.
and you're not coping in unhealthy ways,
Right.
but you found healthier ways to process your emotions and to share them with people and not feel like you have to suppress it and bury it.
Right.
And I think you mentioned earlier coping, so let's define coping a little bit. So coping is kind of the process or mechanism that you use to hide the pain or to distract from the pain, or in a healthy way to process the pain and to deal with the stresses of life that we all have at different stages of life. And the stress doesn't have to be traumatic. The stress could be just as simple as somebody cutting off the highway.
Right.
Yeah, and so that provokes an emotion, and you have a choice on what to do with that. Mm-hmm. And so hearing your story as you've described, that you had this refugee experience and you mm-hmm. in your 20s and you begin to realize, oh, you've got all this emotion to process. I'd imagine that many of your peers don't get to that point at 20. So what was it in your life that drew you out, or you took that step of courage? What happened for you to begin working on that and coming out of that shame?
Yeah, I think for me, it's, it is a personal journey, right? So you're right, we all experience it in different parts of life. Some of us, even maybe going into 30s, 40s, 50s, have not really dealt with it. But for myself, maturity, I think that played a big role. Going through school, going into clinical psychology, and that journey itself, I think my personal experiences have led me there. And then, having to reflect on emotions and, learning about, the human brain, the human heart, emotions, that I think was a huge propeller for change and to recognize what I'm, personally going through. And then I think from there, allowing myself to be angry. I think if we're talking about like being, Asian and having shame, one of the biggest struggles is not being allowed to express your emotions, right? And so for some reason, you internalize that, and even for yourself, you don't do it. It's like, okay, if I allow anger and sadness to come out, then I'm weak somehow. I think it was a lot of fighting that and growing up in that, to where I realized, hey, you know what? This is okay. It's good for me. I need to feel these emotions. So first, giving myself permission to be vulnerable, to be transparent with myself, and then having compassion on the situation, being angry, and then sharing it, letting other people in on the journey, letting people know this is who I am, this is my experience. That itself, I think, brought a lot of healing, and allowed myself to cope positively. I think if we're talking about coping positively, that would be, a space to do so. But I get it. Not everybody has that space, or not everybody has a community and good friends that you feel safe to share to. So that would be another piece, is building good relationships with people, finding a community that's good for you. Staying connected with close friends and family, opening up. Yeah.
Well, I'll share a little bit of my own journey. So by way of self-disclosure, I'm one of those that took a long time for me to get in touch with my emotions, well into my 30s and 40s, and now I'm just beginning into my 50s. And so my background, I went to school studying electrical engineering so that I didn't have to deal with my emotions. And I didn't have to deal with them until my mid-30s, when I had a crisis moment. And when I had that crisis moment, my whole identity and my whole being, my whole thinking and my whole feeling, which just kind of fell apart. So I had to get help. And so that's how I wound up on this, started this journey on getting in touch with my emotions, putting words to them. And even just to find the courage to talk to a counselor was a shameful thing. That's why I held it off so long. And I found other ways to cope through school and through being responsible. And the other factor that kept me from starting on this healing journey was that it seems so countercultural. Was I betraying my Asian heritage, my Chinese culture, to start talking about emotions? Because it's just not done. So my question to you is, how did you decide to study psychology, and how did you deal with that culture aspect of talking, or the culture that doesn't talk about it, and you allowed yourself and started talking about it?
Yeah. So I think one of the biggest contributors to my decisions was my youth ministry experience. I think realizing that I don't have enough tools to work with people and to be with people motivated me to going into psychology. I mean, it wasn't even, oh, my family went through trauma, and so I'm gonna, I think subconsciously it was probably there, because what's interesting about being a human being, right, is that sometimes we are unconscious to ourselves, but when we notice it in other people, then then you can see it, right? So for me, it was, wow, these Hmong families I'm working with are going through so much. These other families are going through so much. I want to know how to help them, And then as you go through the journey of schooling, then it's like, wait a minute, this is also my family. So I think that brought me to that space. So there was never any, I think going into, there was never any like shame of I'm studying this, because as a 18-year-old, you're just like, okay. And for me, it's always interesting. I love people. I love observing people and people's behaviors. And so it was just kind of natural for me to gravitate towards psychology. I think if we're talking about shame, there was a little bit of I think, maybe comments from people in the community, saying, so are you studying psychology because you have issues? Are you trying to like fix yourself through this? And then at that time it's like, no, I'm just interested in this, but I think if I was more self-aware at that time, I would have said, you know what, we all need it. We all need it. And this would be very good for me. So I don't know if that answers your question.
No, that's great. I just wanted to hear what it was like for you, because it isn't exactly at the top of the prestigious social status kinds of jobs that Asian culture values, the way Asian culture values teachers and engineers and lawyers and
Doctors.
Wealthy. Yes, doctors. That's why I was looking for that third esteemed kind of job. Although psychology is kind of a doctor of the soul, but because the doctor of the soul is such an intangible thing, Asian culture likes more tangible things. I mean, humans like more tangible things. So that it might be a little more abstract. But I'm so glad you went on this path. Yeah. You're finding healing not just for yourself, but also for others, and particularly as Hmong Americans.
Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Okay, so no, I was just gonna stop you a little bit because I want to talk a little bit about the expectations, the educational expectations. So within the Southeast Asian culture, there is a general expectation for being a doctor and a lawyer and an engineer as well. But I think I think that's a little softer than maybe the East Asian, because a lot of our elderly people and parents never really went through formal education. And so for them, it's study anything, for my parents particularly, like study anything, get a college degree, get a job. So for me, there wasn't a lot of pressure to be a doctor or a lawyer. It's just go to college. Yeah.
That's great.
So that helped with studying psychology.
Yeah, that's good to know. And then, so how long have you been practicing as a therapist now? And when did your family get into the conversation about processing their life experience?
Yeah, so I've been in the field for, oh my gosh, I guess if you count internships and all that stuff too, more than 10 years. Yeah. So, and then with my family, you asked, like, when did my family start processing this? I think, within the last couple of years. It's my, so I've always tried to talk about it with my parents, right? And when I bring it up, we do talk about it. And then they initiated talking about it for the first time about 2 years ago. They were listening to this radio, this Hmong radio show, and they were talking about the experience of bringing a young child through war and being afraid. And so these families came on and talked about their own experiences. Because when we first fled, my mom was 8 months pregnant with me. And so we stopped at a abandoned village, and my mom gave birth to me there. So then we stayed there for 1 month. So I was 1 month old when they set out again. And my mom said it was arduous because I was crying. And then I had a great grandma that was very slow. And so my parents had said that at that time, the group that we came with didn't want us for obvious reasons. And so the radio show was talking about their own experiences of how so many people gave opium to their kids so that they would sleep, and some kids never woke up again. So there was definitely a lot of sadness. My parents were listening to that. And so one day I came home, and my mom and dad sat me down, and my dad started tearing up, and I was thinking, oh my goodness, what's wrong? Is somebody hurt? Somebody have a sickness? So my dad just says, Minai, that's, honey, I want to tell you something that I feel very sorry about, and I want to confess that to you. And so my dad said, when we were running and you were crying at the top of your lungs, I had thought to give you opium. And, when I thought about it, you're my only child. And so if I had given you opium, what if you didn't wake up anymore? And then I wouldn't have anyone. And so I think it took just them listening to this program. And what's interesting is, these radio programs have never been in the air until recently. So people are, as a people healing, we're finally talking about the pain and the trauma. And so when my parents listened to it, they came and talked about it with me. So we had a good time of reflecting, crying, and healing together. So that was a very powerful. What's interesting is just more recently too, I get messages from friends. I hear my friends talk about their family talking about, the pain and the trauma of war and losing their families. Yeah. And so I think as a people, it's been long enough where I think we have passed that stage of survival. I think I should be careful when I say that. We haven't passed it. We have gotten to a better place where we don't feel like we're just surviving. Now we get to process, thrive, be hurt, be angry. Yeah. So.
Wow, what a journey. And thank you for being part of helping others through that journey, and that your family has come along with you. Is there something else you want to say before we wrap up this episode?
No, not really.
Okay. Well, yeah. Here's the thing. Okay, so here's my closing question then.
Okay.
So the issue of refugees has been in the news, not just in America, but around the world, because there are wars and things happening, and there are refugees moving to Germany, moving to America and France and other parts of the world because of things happening in war-torn countries. So having had the kind of experience that you've had as a refugee yourself and working with them, what would you say to those in government and those that are not refugees of what can we do or say to help people that are in this really tenuous place of life?
Yeah. So I think treat them as humans. These are people who, have had families and a life, thriving life. And, I think humanize them, be in their shoes, have compassion on them. Think about your own families if they, go through it. I think from that perspective, a lot can, come out of it. A lot of help can come out of it. A lot of good can come out of that. Yeah. So that's the short answer.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Mm-hmm. Thank you, Maylee. Thank you so much for sharing your life and your experience. Yeah. And we both desire to help others on this journey of healthy living and getting out of that darkness of shame. So that wraps up this episode. Maylee, Chang, and I'm DJ Chuang. We're signing off, and you can stay connected with us at erasingshame.com. Like us on Facebook, subscribe to us on YouTube or iTunes, and we invite your feedback. We would love to hear a bit of your story, and we want to create a safe place for you to begin your healing journey as well. If you've gone through trauma or crisis or stress or anxiety or whatever, we have a safe place for you to leave an anonymous message as well at our website, because on Facebook you have to kind of identify yourself, but we want to create a safe place just for you to begin letting that out of the suppression and the pains of all that. So until next week, we're still looking for a timeline or tagline. So we're working on that, but look forward to connecting with you again. Thank you. Bye-bye, Maylee.
Bye.
And bye-bye, listeners, watchers. Bye-bye.